Atomic Heart is a great game if you stop playing after 3 hours. During the final 12 hours it takes to complete a casual playthrough of the main story, things take a dramatic turn for the worse. To be clear, there isn't one single point where everything just falls apart, as instead, many components start to degrade into frustration, monotony, or stupidity over time. This is true of the combat system, the overall narrative direction, and even the presentation. Nothing is salvaged by the time the credits roll. And that's a shame, because the opening bits really lull you in with a sense that this will be worth your time. That, paired up with the pedigree of the games that inspired it, will have you believing that Atomic Heart is really onto something, like it may just recapture the magic of those titles. But sadly, no. An inescapable sensation washes over you as you continue to play. Head-scratching annoyances become habit, nuisances become problems, enjoyable mechanics fall into repetition, and the story goes off the rails. Despite those problems, Atomic Heart did manage to keep my interest from beginning to end, but sadly, that was due to expectations created by its biggest source of inspiration, Bioshock. The rich atmosphere and bold storytelling of that title is what got me interested in this one, and it's what kept me playing even as my enthusiasm faltered. Unfortunately, the pursuit of an epic, mind-blowing plot twist never really came, or at least to the extent it did in that title, and by the time the credits rolled, all I could think was that Atomic Heart was a letdown. Before we get into the bad though, let's establish why this game starts off on such a strong footing. Upon starting things up, you take control of a Russian enforcer named P3. The game shows you society in an alternate reality, where the USSR was a more supreme power than the United States following the end of World War II. Everything looks happy and peaceful as you float down a river, chatting away with your cyborg glove named Charles while your fellow humans celebrate and robot companions aid in everyday activities. It seems like a paradise. It's clear that this is a society where robot and AI technology have flourished, and it's easy to get lost in the spectacle of it all. What also stands out is that P3 is an asshole.
I really love this place. Good vibes.
The Chelomey complex was built from the ground up to be the ideal comfortable workplace.
Mechanic glove. I've been here before.
And I'm absolutely there for it after playing as a wet blanket in Hogwarts Legacy. He's by no means the best protagonist of all time, but he has personality. It's so rare that games make their main character a jerk by default, and I think that's why it works so well here. He's not mean, but he isn't afraid to raise his voice, belittle others, and complain, and I kinda liked it. It was funny at times. He also had this weird quirk where he says, "crispy critters," when something crazy happens, and it made me chuckle every time. Like, explosions would be going off, robots are dying, shit's going down, and he's just like, "crispy critters."
State your name and personal access code.
Crispy critters.
Invalid name.
Fine, I'll hack in.
I loved it. But anyway, pushing through the parade, we reach our boss's office. Here, we're ordered by Dr. Sheshenov, the leader of the USSR, to investigate a robot malfunction. From here, we're whisked away in a flying car, revealing we've been on a floating city this whole time. It's one of two obvious visual callbacks to Bioshock. As we descend to the true surface, the loud celebratory sounds of Chelomey are replaced with a bombardment of robot attacks, crashing our ride in the process. Soon, a deadly silence washes over the environment as the AIs continue to hunt us down. Grabbing a handy fire axe, we make our way down to an in-shambles research center where disaster has clearly struck. Dead bodies litter the ground, and the only thing left moving now are those once friendly companion robots who are hell-bent on killing you. Our job is to find their creators and stop the robots' rampage before word of this disaster and loss can spread. The player will then spend a good 2 to 3 hours in this facility before reaching the surface again, but by the time they see daylight, they'll be optimistic after what they experience here. Starting with atmosphere, and this station is absolutely dripping with a haunted feeling. Everything is dark, the scientists and soldiers are all slaughtered, yet still some of them talk to you. An in-game neurological invention called polymer keeps their brains functioning for a little while after the body dies, allowing them to communicate. In essence, they have consciousness while being trapped in a dead body, and that's a horrifying thought in its own right. Between interacting with these folks and finding pocket watch audio files akin to those found in Bioshock, the player begins to piece together what happened here. The helpful companion robots suddenly entered combat mode and began viewing the people here as a threat to the Soviet Empire, and therefore they were in need of being disposed of. It makes for a dripping atmosphere, and you aren't immune from the robots' rage either, as they attack you without warning and without mercy as you inch your way through the destroyed remains. The game so effortlessly captures that terrifying feeling of being chased by something, as when the robots come after you, they do so immediately, quickly, and without remorse. That, paired up with their uncanny appearance, makes for moments that will genuinely frighten you and trigger a fight or flight reaction. The non-humanoid robots don't inspire this sensation quite as heavily, but they can be quite formidable too. Regardless, when it's time to fight, you better be ready. The panicked feeling of being chased leads you into these frantic fights where you crazily swing your axe, hoping that the next blow will be enough to incapacitate the foe. One-on-one fights are hectic but manageable, but soon the tension is ramped up with rooms of 2, 3, and even 4 enemies. Here, it makes more sense to consider using one of your guns, but in this facility, ammo feels kinda scarce, so it feels more right to hoard it. I found myself only breaking out the heavy-hitting shotgun in extreme emergencies, and I love that. Resources were precious, a commodity meant to be saved and cherished, but all that goes to hell when there's a crazed mustachio robot performing a flying kick on you at high speeds. When you're not fighting, the facility will often require you to solve puzzles to progress, of which there is a good variety of them. These included repeated puzzles like these light segments where you have to twist the dial to line things up correctly, or these audio puzzles where you have to snap your fingers in sync with the beat. Besides these though, there's also one-off puzzles like this one where you have to move super cooled ice balls into overheating boilers. It's easy to appreciate these sorts of puzzles because they don't solve themselves. The player isn't told exactly what to do. They may be nudged towards an important interactable item needed to solve the puzzle, but they aren't told what it does or what they need to do after using it. This leads to a lot of moments where the player must intuit the solution for themselves, and that continues on for the entirety of the game. It was frustrating once or twice, but most of the time, these one-off puzzles were a delight. So yes, the game's opening is brilliant. We get the wonderful parade scene that builds up the setting and the atmosphere, and then we get down and see the reverse side, where things have gone to shit. And after a few hours of soaking up that spooky atmosphere, piecing together more about this world and what happened to it, fighting off killer robots, and solving some intelligently designed puzzles, the player will emerge back to the surface, eager for what's to come. Unfortunately, this marks the beginning of the end for the style of gameplay you just experienced. Atomic Heart has two different types of levels. There's dungeons, like the one we just managed to escape from, and there's also an open world, although that term can only be used in the lightest sense of the word. There isn't a vast open play space where you're free to move around, as instead, you can think of this area as a series of connected small towns that you move between via dirt roads. It ends up still being quite linear as you're shuffled from dungeon to dungeon for the next story bit. To be quite honest, I think this approach is fine for this particular game. The developers have said in interviews that their intention was to never let the player get too far away from the story and the world building. A true open world may have allowed them to get distracted by map markers and side quests, which would detract from the story they wanted to tell. As a result, they compromised with this smaller open space. The player is still free to move about it as they see fit, stopping in buildings to loot for resources using an amazing tool. This is a side tangent, but you loot in this game by essentially vacuuming everything up out of cabinets like you're a magnet. It's amazing, it feels great. With that being said though, you won't really find any small explorable optional towns on the surface like you might in a game like, say, Fallout. Instead, the only thing you'll really find in terms of side content are more underground puzzle dungeons that reward you with new weapons or weapon upgrades. For me, the story was the driving force in the game, and so I hardly felt bothered to explore these. I did a couple just to check them out, but true to the developer's intent, I felt like it was taking away from the narrative. For me, this quote-unquote open world didn't detract from the game, but I can see how many players would be disappointed because of that label. There is a lack of exploration, a lack of side quests, and a lack of map markers that you might find in other open world games, so don't go in with that expectation. Luckily, the game shines most when you're in the dungeons, and there's still a handful left of them after the first. Unfortunately though, many of them fail to live up to the quality and mood of that first one. Mainly, that's owed to the combat encounters that go from being Resident Evil 2-like to Doom-like. What I really enjoyed about fights in the opening dungeon was that the robots and myself felt like we were on even footing. They could whoop me, and I them. I felt satisfied after winning a fight against one or two of them without using my ammunition, but I also felt uneasy after fights that drained my bullets, health packs, and other limited resources. It fostered a nice balance with tension at the center of it. As we move further into the game though, it adopts more of an action-based combat system, which feels a bit disingenuous to the opening tutorial. Rooms that may have had 2 or 3 enemies turn into rooms with waves of foes, each containing between 5 to 10 enemies apiece, and sometimes more. It was not uncommon to enter a room, be rushed by a relentless onslaught, overcome it, and begin solving the puzzle to get out, only to be mobbed again. The balance of combat is thrown right out the window, as it's extremely easy to get overwhelmed. You're given more ammunition to use those more powerful guns, but you have to unlearn saving your resources, and even then, the combat still feels unfair. When 5 enemies are all attacking you at the same time, some ranged, some up close, it becomes super frustrating for a multitude of reasons. This includes your relatively limited mobility, getting caught up on environmental objects, having to dodge a multitude of attacks before getting off one of your own, how hard the enemies can hit, being staggered or knocked down, having to replay long sections after dying, adding boss fights to normal encounters, how much health enemies have, how you're expected to juggle other activities like locating and destroying nests while you're fighting, how hard it can be to aim properly, and much, much more. That's a ton of noticeable and detrimental issues. One by one, these problems suck the enjoyment right out of fights, leading to an unbalanced mess where combat feels genuinely unfair and stacked against you. I don't fault anyone who has to bump the difficulty down to easy. I did, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have had the willpower to finish the game. In short, the problem is that you're put into Doom-like action sequences without having the souped-up skills and weapons of Doom Guy. That's because, despite the switch to a more fast-paced, action-packed combat system, the game still continues with the Resident Evil approach to inventory. In other words, you're limited on what you can carry, which seems bizarre after how resource-taxing the fights become. Using those gathered resources, the player can craft and upgrade new weapons and consumables so long as they have the required blueprints and materials to do so. They can be equipped only while interacting with this horny robot. Yes, you heard that right, you'll see. Here, the player can also use resources harvested from dead enemies to upgrade their skills. This includes exploring a few different skill trees. Some are general ones like overall buffs to health, but the most interesting ones are those that are inspired by Bioshock. Akin to plasmids, players can equip their glove Charles with different abilities, such as shock or frost. These, along with shield and a polymer launcher that makes enemies more susceptible to other status ailments, were the ones I used during my playthrough. And to be quite honest, they were helpful tools, but they failed to capture the creativity found in some of Bioshock's plasmids, which was a real shame. They ended up being generic too, and I think that's just bad. There was room for new ideas in this space, but they settled for the basics, and it was disappointing. So yeah, the combat system devolves as you play, as it undergoes a bit of an identity crisis. It draws inspiration from 3 very different styles and tries to mash it all up into one, and it doesn't work. I started out really enjoying the combat, but by the end, I loathed it. This was true even for the game's spectacle boss fights against some really powerful robots, many of which I can't help but to feel were ripped straight from the Omnidroid 1000. Still, they were good enough to make note of here. Overall though, combat was a mess, and it wasn't something I enjoyed. About halfway through, I made the switch to easy, which felt more like normal difficulty, and from there, I slogged my way through it. Well, if combat stinks, maybe those puzzles hold up. Well, no. Many of the more unique one-off puzzles go to the wayside in favor of repeating more of these lock puzzles. To be clear, there are still some good ones, like this ballerina statue puzzle in the theater dungeon. By the way, this particular dungeon is the closest the game comes to matching the quality level of the first one. It's really solid. But anyway, yeah, these lock puzzles become more and more heavily used as you play, and they get really old. The snapping puzzles in particular are difficult to get in sync with because the rhythm changes as you release each individual lock. And the color light puzzles get more mind-bending as well, which is fine, you'd expect that. Funny enough though, the combat ends up bringing down these puzzles too. That's right, it doesn't just destroy itself, it destroys puzzles along with it. I found myself wanting to get past fights quickly by trying to sneak past enemies. The stealth sucks too, by the way. But when you run into a door locked behind one of these puzzles, you have to solve it in real time. This isn't done quickly, and enemies can spot you while you work, forcing a complete restart of the puzzle after another arduous fight. I hated that. Another thing that will detract and distract from Atomic Heart is its presentation, as you'd be extremely hard-pressed to call this game's visuals up to par with the industry standard. I'm willing to give developer Mundfish a bit of a pass for this though, as this is their debut game. Visually, I'd say this game looks like a late PlayStation 3 or early PlayStation 4 title. This was probably owed to the smaller budget, and so it's really out of the team's hands, but it is noticeable. There are moments of beauty, but it never seemed to push my Xbox Series S to its limits. The overall design was also questionable at times, with various issues popping up throughout the experience. I found myself getting stuck in environmental objects or just getting plain lost, unsure of what to do. The game doesn't hold your hand a lot, which I appreciated most of the time, but it did frustrate on occasion. For example, I could never figure out how to switch to other forms of consumables like energy pods or different levels of healing items. I tried every input I could think of, and none of it worked. And also, movement felt very finicky at times, certainly in need of more fine-tuning to flow better. Audio design was equally as rough. The music was tense or action-packed depending on the mood of the moment, but nothing stood out as memorable. Occasionally, the combat theme would glitch out and continue to play after fights ended. Audio cueing and sound effects needed a lot of work too. It just felt like a ton of them were outright missing, whether it was guns and cutscenes or literal explosions in the gameplay. I'm trying to keep this spoiler free, so I won't show the final boss, but right before it, I unlocked a mini nuke, and the explosion and sound effect from this gun is so pathetic that it made me laugh out loud while playing what was supposed to be the epic final showdown. The only thing that stood out to me as good in this audio department was the voice work. Both P3 and Charles were excellent and managed to keep my attention every time they spoke. Some will be turned off by the written dialogue, but I love the dynamic between the two. And that makes for a good time to jump back into the story, as it's really what will keep you playing as these other factors grow increasingly more irritating. As you venture through the underground bunkers, you and P3 will learn more about this world and how you're truly but a pawn within it. You'll uncover a government conspiracy involving mind control and global conquest. It even takes these very militaristic ideas of control a step further by incorporating science fiction elements like human transcendence, high-level AI technology, and the discovery of a new powerful chemistry compound. I don't want to dive into spoilers, but it is pretty interesting stuff that manages to hold your attention, especially in the final third of the game as those sci-fi themes begin to take over. There are also two big plot twists that occur in the game. One about 90% of the way through, and another right as the story wraps up. Neither capture the magic like Bioshock's did. Hell, it isn't even as good as the lesser Bioshock Infinite's plot twist, but at least one of them is alright. Predictable, but alright. The narrative, along with the evolution of P3 and Charles' relationship, is what makes the game worth seeing it through to the end. Now, some may view playing as a Soviet as a turnoff, especially given the current state of global affairs, so it's worth being aware of before you play. The Soviet Union and Russia are not one for one, but they're different shades of the same problem. The real-world country's current agenda may make playing a game about conquering the Western world a bit too much to bear, but I don't think there was any malicious intent behind the game's choice of setting. It's quite clear this is a fictionalized world, and development began before the current invasion. For me, it was a non-issue, but I can understand how others may not want to engage with this content at this current time. It's a valid reason in its own right. With that out of the way, we have one disappointment left to cover, and that would be the ending. Again, no spoilers, but the ending is very bleak, regardless of which of the two you get. That's right, there's multiple endings, and you'll choose directly which you want, but neither feels satisfying. The intended ending in particular is very grim, which may be on brand if Redditors' comments on the nature of Russian literature is to be believed. Still, it feels like sequel baiting at best and completely gloomy at worst. All the intrigue built up during this political and sci-fi thriller is sort of undercut with the ending. They attempt to subvert your expectations, but they do so by making sure there is no way of wrapping things up in a positive way. I don't believe every game has to have a happy ending. After all, I love both of the Last of Us titles, but here, it feels really underdeveloped. There's a final plot twist that has no room to breathe. It happens, and then the credits roll, to the game's detriment. As the screen fades to black, so too do the last bits of enjoyment fostered by the opening 3 hours. With all of this being said, I can see how people will still find a way to play and enjoy Atomic Heart from beginning to end, even if that wasn't the case for me. Many of the game's shortcomings can be forgiven due to this being the first title Mundfish has ever put out there. With that in mind, they could have done a lot worse. So for me, Atomic Heart becomes something different. In that context, I can view it as a decent start for an upcoming developer. Hopefully, the issues outlined by critics can be internalized and worked on in pursuit of a sequel or a new IP. This, along with a bigger budget and the experience of having one game finished, could lead to something pretty good. For now though, Atomic Heart ends up being a disappointment. It starts off so wonderfully, but nearly every component erodes over time, whether it's due to repetition or just trying to be too much. The combat becomes extremely unfair and marred with many different problems. You'll be hit with the same type of puzzles over and over endlessly. The atmosphere remains rich, but the lack of detail work in visuals and audio do make its presence wane over time. And while the story remains engaging and interesting throughout, it can't quite stick the landing. Ultimately, Atomic Heart's biggest issue is that it was drinking from too many wells. High on the inspiration from games like Resident Evil, Bioshock, and Doom, the developers failed to understand why each of those games are great in their own right. Attempting to blend the best elements from each leads to a Frankenstein game that never lives up to the standards set by those industry legends. And in the end, Atomic Heart is a foolish jack of all trades and a master of none. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed this review of Atomic Heart. I've seen a lot of discourse about this one online. There's a lot of people that love it, there's a lot of people that hate it, and there's a lot in between. And that's where I fall. I'd say this game is underwhelming within its design, but it gives me excitement for the future, to see what Mundfish may make next. I'm optimistic, but not sold. So what do you think of this game? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, join our Discord, the link is below, and as always guys, have a nice day and take care.